Ah, got it. Okay. So, welcome everybody to the kickoff meeting of the GC3 Adaptation Planning and Implementation Working Group. Really appreciate everybody's willingness to jump into this. There's been a lot of interest in this in the GC3 and this working group. I appreciate the enthusiasm for sure. And so I think we have the membership pretty well established at this point, but doesn't mean it won't change a little bit, maybe expand a little bit further even as we go. Just want to, let's make sure this works. Maybe, somehow. Mary Beth, could you just hit the...
Hit them? Sure.
There, this should work. You got it?
And can I mean, it's okay for people to sit up.
Nobody wants to sit up there.
And if you want to, like, pull chairs up, and I know it is cold and flu and coronavirus season, but if you want to pull up, well, just because also since we're being recorded, the microphone, for recording purposes, so, but, feel free to pull up a seat and, get cozy.
All right.
Even in this, I don't know, welcome to it.
That one doesn't have a microphone.
It's the hot seat.
Yeah.
You don't have to raise your right hand when you sit there.
Yeah, it works now. All right, so, and I'm Brian Thompson from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and the deep lead on this working group. So again, thanks all for coming. I'll do a quick run through of the agenda. I'm the MC for today. So we'll do welcome and introductions around the room, quick overview of the GC3 and the working group structure, the overview of our deliverables and the timeline, talk about our roles and expectations, take a quick look back at the 2011 Connecticut Climate Preparedness Plan, which we are charged with reviewing and updating. Look at a sort of rough table of contents that we have envisioned for its draft at this point, but what we've envisioned the report to look like. And then Circa, to my right here, will provide a little presentation on some work they're doing and how it interfaces, and we'll have a public comment period and some next steps. So, with that,
Brian?
Yes.
There are public sign-in sheets
Okay.
here, so if anybody from the public is interested in speaking, if you could just sign up. And then add your email, if you have to be added to the listserv.
Okay. Thank you, Mary Beth. So we'll do introductions. We'll go to my right. John, you want to?
Sure. John Trzynski, Director of Resilience Planning at Circa.
I'm Joanna Wozniak-Brown, the Senior Resilience Planner at Circa.
I'm Patrick Carlton. I'm Deputy Director with the Connecticut Metropolitan Council of Governments.
George Grinder, Property Casualty Director for the Connecticut Insurance Department.
Laura Bosey, the Director of Programs at the
I'm Robert Bell, Director at the Department of Transportation in Policy.
Town Planner, Guilford.
I'm Stephanie Cohen with the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, a work sector, and standing in for Chairman Marissa.
Why don't we go back to Adam?
member of the Connecticut Academy.
Sorry, did we miss you? Did we get, oh, I'm sorry. Wanted to make sure we got you. No, no. I must have zoned out on that one. All right, so, oh, I'm sorry, good point. Are there members on
Hi.
the phone? Anyone else on the phone?
That's Alex Felton here on the phone from Circa.
Welcome, Alex. Anybody else? Okay. So I wanted to, and I'm gonna try to keep us on schedule relatively. So it's, kind of rough timeline, but I will try to keep us on a schedule as best we can. But so the objectives for today are so that we we develop a more common understanding of why we're here, what our mandate is, what it is we need to accomplish, clarify what the structure and purpose of the GC3 and working group are, and what the process is, and I think importantly, as the first meeting, we want to set out a meeting schedule, and I have a proposed general schedule of meetings. We certainly want to set a date as soon as we can for the next meeting so that everybody has enough lead time. We want to clarify our various roles and participation in the theme or focus areas that have been established for this working group. And finally, at the end of the day, end of the meeting, set out some objectives for us, what we need to get done before the next meeting. So just starting with the overview of the GC3 and the working group structure. So the GC3 was reestablished by Executive Order Number 3 from Governor Lamont, and it has objectives both related to climate mitigation strategies and adaptation implementation strategies. So for this particular working group, I've only put up the adaptation related objectives, but they are to do an inventory of vulnerable assets and operations. That is not directly the task of this working group. There is another working group that is leading that effort, but it's certainly one of the aspects of the work that this group needs to consider. So the one in red is what our focus area is, which is revising and updating the statewide adaptation and resilience plan. And then also there's a task of aligning our adaptation strategies with existing planning processes. So the structure of the GC3 looks like this. There's a Governor's Council on Climate Change at the top, and we have a few representatives of the GC3 in the room here. Then there is a Climate Change Mitigation Subcommittee and a Climate Change Adaptation and Resiliency Subcommittee. And below those subcommittees are various working groups, as indicated in the boxes, and some of them feed up primarily directly to either mitigation or adaptation. So, for example, on the right-hand box there's the Assessing Vulnerabilities in State Assets and Operations, and the Financing Adaptation working groups, as well as this working group, Adaptation and Planning and Implementation, again, that feed up primarily to Climate Change Adaptation and Resiliency Subcommittee. But there certainly is some crossover that may occur, or interaction that may need to occur between the working groups. And that box in the middle are the working groups that really have very clear objectives or mandates in both mitigation and adaptation areas. Any questions on the overall structure at this point? Hearing none. So this is the timeline for the overall deliverables under the executive order. So our end date for producing a report to the governor on adaptation and resilience planning is January 15th of 2021. We'll have some more detailed timeline coming up, but basically it is, looking at the scientific information that's available, and analytical tools regarding various aspects of climate change, and considering how climate change will affect land use and demographics within the state of Connecticut, and how we may need to adapt or efforts we can make to be more resilient to those changes. So overall timeline to hit that January 2021 date for a final report is so starting, the GC3 kicked off in December of 2019. The working groups have started to meet in January, February, and beginning of March. And so those will be working to develop draft recommendations generally through the summer, culminating in an August, September timeframe for having a draft of a report that we can then put out for public comment and receive comments and make revisions to finalize in December and have a final report to the governor in January. Any questions on the overall timeline? Questions, comments? Okay. We've sort of identified some of the key questions that this group will need to address to develop the recommendations for the final report. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just questions that have come up in internal discussions at DEEP. We certainly think we'll add to the list as we move forward with the workings of the working group. But it's, looking at what was recommended in the 2011 report and what kind of progress have we made on meeting those recommendations or moving forward on those recommendations. Which of those recommendations should we continue to pursue? That was a decade ago. Things have changed a great deal, obviously, in a decade with respect to climate change and our understanding of climate change. So, you know, should we continue to pursue those? Do some of them need to be modified, or should they be dropped? And we also need to look at what new strategies and objectives we might need to set out. And, you know, what are the gaps? Where do we need to fill? What kind of tools and information do we need to be able to characterize our facilities? What are our critical infrastructure assets? And what are land use policies and practices that we may need to consider implementing moving forward? So, for those familiar with the 2011 report, it focused on 4 key sectors, and they were agriculture, infrastructure, natural resources, and public health. Thank you. Blanked on that one. So those 4 sectors, and it didn't sort of address land use as a focus area, but I think that's certainly something we need to. And so we need to, in doing our work, in considering adaptation strategies, we need to be thinking about how those strategies might affect natural resources. And we also need to keep in mind throughout all this vulnerable populations and communities, and how climate change affects those communities, and how what we propose might affect those communities, either beneficially or not. No, this is very high level at this point. Any thoughts on any of these or key questions? Yes, Dr. Bosby.
And maybe you'll cover this later, but.
Yep. Good question. Let me just, probably touched on this one back here. So there's a science and technology working group that has not had their first meeting yet, but the membership's been established. So that will provide a lot of the guidance for the kind of analysis we need. And I mean, there's been a good deal of analysis that exists, and so we'll make best use of what's out there. But we certainly, I think, will identify that there are additional analytical needs that will bubble up from this process. And, you know, we may not be able to accomplish that analysis in the time span that we have to do this work, but you know, those analytical requirements that are longer term, I think can be incorporated into recommendations of the working groups.
Brian, stay with that slide that you just had there for a moment.
Yep.
So there are, looks like 6 or 7 separate working group committees. Do we envision that each one of those working group committees will produce one document, written document, that then goes up to the next level and is in some way sized with the other reports, such that when it gets all the way to the top, it's some report or set of recommendations that are fairly succinct and writing and clear to whoever is going to implement this report, these recommendations? How does that work?
That is a good question.
Do we know that?
We will touch on that a little bit later when we talk about I mentioned a draft table of contents. But so DEEP is the overall coordinating entity on this, and so we have staff involved in each of the working groups. And again, we have a vision for what the overall report looks like and sections of the overall report to be developed and how the working groups will feed into those various sections. There will be products produced by each of the working groups that will then be synthesized into that final report. James, did I do that justice?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Because I could envision that we'd end up with, hundreds or thousands of pages of, text from all these various committees that somehow doesn't really make itself into a clear directive for somebody. Oversimple with it, but, we need to.
Yeah, no, well, that's a great point. And, one of the goals we have in mind with this report is to develop recommendations that have some specific and time-bounded outcomes. So we'll have some broader strategies as well, I think, but we want to be able to identify some goals and objectives, actions that we can accomplish in a year or 5 years, and we can say, yeah, we did that. So I think looking back at the 2011 report, there was some really, really good strategy level recommendations there, but a lot of it was not very specific and time bounded. So it's hard to sort of look back and say, yeah, we accomplished that, working from that report. So, yes. So I guess for purposes of the recording, I will repeat the question. So the question was, is the working group list, meaning this? Yeah, that is complete. Correct, James? Yep. Is that not a working group? That is a group within this group. Okay. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's see. I think okay, here we go. I'll go to this slide and then go back to the others. But, so. Okay. Yep. Yep. Sure. So, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, the last report had those four sectors that were addressed, and public health being one of them. So, in this structure, let me jump back to the overall structure slide. In this structure, natural resources and agriculture, which were two of the sectors addressed before, are being covered under the Working and Natural Lands Working Group. That's in the middle box. All right, so then the other two sectors from 2011 effort were infrastructure and public health, and those have been assigned to this working group to address. So if I can go back now. Okay, so so this shows the structure of this working group, adaptation planning and implementation. So with Deep as a lead and Circa providing assistance, and then we have co-chairs, Matt Fulda, who couldn't be here today, and George Kroll have volunteered to be the overall co-chairs. And then we have these 4 theme areas within the working group. So transportation, Rob Bell from DOT is leading that theme area. There's a utility infrastructure theme area that Chairman Gillette from Pura is leading, a public health and safety theme area that Deputy Commissioner Aaron is leading, and then a land use and buildings theme area that, again, Fulda and George Kroll are leading. So for purposes of this group, we felt it important to sort of keep these together because and not break out as more siloed subgroups. So the Working in Natural Lands working group, if anybody here is involved in those as well, broke out into 4 distinct subgroups below that working group. And they're working sort of independently. I think because we expect there's a lot of cross-pollination that needs to happen within this adaptation discussion, we wanted to keep the themes together and just have some sort of individual efforts going on in each area. So these theme areas will have some separate discussions and feed into this working group. Yep. Okay. Sure, okay, sounds good.
Yeah, and kind of following up on that, so what's the recommendation to bring to the legislature? But at what level
I think that's in part for this group to decide. It may be all of the above. I think there may be some policy recommendations to the legislature. There may be some guidance for state agencies, and some guidance for municipalities. Well, for state agencies, it may be a little more than guidance, but for municipalities. Good question. Okay, so I'm going to back up a couple of slides now. Okay, so hit that one. So the timeline for this working group, just generally roughed out, is so first meeting today. We'll look at some big picture items related to the work we need to get done. The thought is a roughly 6-week interval between meetings at this point, and that will allow some time between the meetings for work to happen in the various areas, and then feedback into the next working group meeting. So, looking at a late April meeting, an early June meeting, mid-July, and then the latter part of August. So I have identified tentative dates. Those are very tentative at this point. Just sort of looked at the calendar and, which dates seem to make sense. They're all Thursdays, since we started on a Thursday, but all of that is flexible. So thoughts on the general timing of meetings? Yes, Robert.
Not looking for an
Yes, I agree. Given that we're on a fairly compressed timeline for the overall project, so I'm not sure it'll play out as ideally as we would like, but to the extent that we can get input from those other leading up to the culmination of our work, we will try to do that. I agree. Particularly, however, the state asset vulnerability assessment is on really a different timeline that didn't have a deadline for completion. And so we won't have all of the information from that at the point that we would need it to produce this report. To the extent that we can, we'll incorporate what they've worked on. Sure. Mary Beth, can you address that? You've been a little closer to that than I have. Yeah, so that really is certainly happening at the GC3 level, the full council level. I think if we see there's a need for working groups to get together and have discussions amongst themselves, we can do that too. Yes, George. Yes, agreed. Great point. And I think, so the group has been assembled with the intention of having a fairly broad representation across all of those areas, broad and balanced representation across those 4 theme areas. And it's fairly obvious where some people fit under each theme, others maybe not so much. But I happen to have a sign-up sheet that I'm going to send around. Thanks for teeing that up, George. If folks could, and I populated it with all of the working group member names. There's a few spaces below that if there are others associated with the working group who want to just write in their name. But if you could identify, there's columns for each of the areas, if you could identify which area you are most interested in or have expertise in and would like to participate in. It can be one area, it can be 2 areas, it can be all of them if you want, but I'd be concerned about spreading a little thin. So I'm going to send that around, and those identified as theme area leads don't have to sign up. You're already identified on here for that purpose. So John, if you wouldn't mind sending that over that way. But yes, great question. So just sort of getting back to this schedule then, does that seem like a good overall structure for meeting schedule moving forward? More often, less often? I mean, we can adapt it as we need to as we move along, but just for general framework and planning purposes right now, anybody have any concerns or suggestions as to overall schedule? Okay. We'll go with that, and we will nail down the exact dates through some email communications following up from this meeting. But we'll go with that as the overall working group timeline. All right. So based on some, again, sort of formulation within DEEP, this is the general sequence of tasks that we kind of see rolling out here in different time frames. So, before the April meeting, for example, looking at the 2011 recommendations and doing an update on the progress to date. And incidentally, we have compiled all of those recommendations into an Excel spreadsheet where we can keep track of any progress to date and then recommendations about how to move forward on those particular strategies. And DEEP has started to populate that. What I would ask is that then the other working group members populate that as well. But yes, Dawn. Yep. Mary Beth, you want to address that one too? That's an evolving situation, but I think we're almost there.
Okay. I just asked if we're going to have like a OneDrive document for all of us to work on those kind of shared documents.
So we are working with our DEP.
question. So, I don't think at this point we need to go through all of these tasks in detail, but just wanted to sort of give a sense for what we need to accomplish at various steps along the way. And again, that may, likely will evolve as we get more into this. Yeah, generally questions, Stephanie? Yep.
You might get to this already, but within the focus areas, so is there going to be an attempt to try to assign, based on the 2011 recommendations, kind of which sub area is most relevant to look at that, or is that going to be done at like a working group level discussion?
We've started on that.
Okay.
So we've gone through the 2011 recommendations, identified the ones that look like they belong to this working group.
Okay.
Sort of started the process, and actually there is a slide coming up with some of them allocated to the different sectors,
Okay.
not all of them, but, yep. That doesn't mean that somebody on the working group, we may see things that weren't identified as belonging to this working group or to one of the focus areas. We can work on other things if we think it's appropriate. This was just sort of our initial cut at where things belong.
In that first March, April category, the second bullet of compiling existing and local, regional, and other plans, is that something that it will be done in an overarching sense by DEEP, or is that something for each theme area to do on its own?
So we have sort of a start on that, courtesy of our Circa friends, that I think you'll see shortly when they do their presentation. But yeah, I think we will identify sort of centrally, to the extent that we know them, what the plans are, and then we would ask the working group members to identify some that may be, ones they know of that may be missing. Yep, good question. Okay, I'm going to move on at this point. We'll, delve into this list of tasks again, I'm sure, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense for the overall time frame. So back to this slide that we touched on earlier, the roles and expectations. Again, we have DEEP as the overall coordination, and Circa assisting us in various fashions, and then the two co-chairs primarily, and the theme areas. So what I'd like to do is offer an opportunity for the co-chairs and theme area leads to offer any maybe brief vision on how they, what they see as needs in their area, or an approach to take in their area, or just very briefly, minute or two. George, would you be able to sort of lead that off as one of the overall co-chairs?
Sure. I think what I envision is that between now and the 23rd, there'll be a group of 4 or 5 or a half a dozen of us that have an interest in that particular area. Or maybe by some kind of conference. Biography of those people on the committee, we could think the focus, obviously my focus and my area of expertise is on what's happening at least on the front line, so the buildings in that theme area. Perhaps there'll be some focus, and this may dovetail with another group on
Just to clarify the point on buildings in that theme area, so we wanted to be sure that we captured sort of non-infrastructure structures.
right. Okay.
And so certainly I think, George, you know, in insurance-related matters, building code play into that.
Right. Okay.
We pre-assigned you that anyway, George.
I'd also add to that, if you give
Yep, good point. Thank you, James. Right. Others? Robert? Would you-
The,
put your phone on mute.
well, for transportation, there's clearly a lot of work to do on resiliency issues around the state, at the state level, at the local level, at the regional level. And on one hand, it's kind of daunting in terms of how much infrastructure is out there that everybody uses, and what the potential impacts may be from changes that are occurring. However, the good news is I think we're not starting from scratch. In its most basic sense, transportation is built around engineering, and engineering is resiliency. Since long ago, engineering has existed, and its purpose is to build things that can withstand all kinds of forces put upon it, whether it's weight or motion, or whether it's external climate-related issues like precipitation and temperature changes and wind. So the good news is that our transportation infrastructure has already been designed to withstand all various types of forces. The challenge and the difficulty is that as we continuously update our technical and scientific information that we use to design and to construct transportation assets, is making sure we incorporate the changes that are occurring with climate change issues, and so that we take advantage of the best available technical information and science as it's currently developing, and so that we're as smart as we can be for our future work. So that's one great benefit of the GC3 and these working groups, is to be able to harness the best and most current information that individually we might not get our hands on, but collectively we can learn about and vet and then have confidence in and use. Also, looking forward to the partnerships that we're going to create, or we're creating here, and learning from each other, you know, state learning from local, local learning from state, and individuals learning from entities, and vice versa. So there's a tremendous opportunity here to be more powerful together than we are individually. I hope that when we develop our plans, we can focus on things like fix it first and state of good repair, because a lot of that work, if it's funded and is done well, contributes significantly to a resilient and adaptive infrastructure.
Okay, thank you, Rob. I'm going to actually go to Stephanie. I'll come back to you, Commissioner, in a moment. But yeah, Stephanie.
Continue with the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Through line, sure. So I think from Pura's perspective, and again, the chairman apologizes, she's at the legislature doing testimony this morning. that we're happy to kind of help set the foundation in terms of from Pure's perspective, obviously with an eye towards what the public service companies or utilities in the state are already doing, and a lot of that has related to kind of storm hardening and resiliency measures. And so we have various kind of reporting and tracking mechanisms to continuously monitor and require improvements where needed from that kind of perspective. I think there's also like from a system reliability perspective, I think there's some information that certainly will benefit from getting a broader group of stakeholders kind of looking at the materials, kind of what's been done to date, and help identify any gaps or, again, areas that this group may, wish to rise for recommendations. So I think just kind of that's our take on it.
Great, thank you. And Commissioner Aaron, on public health and safety matters.
Good morning, everyone. We looked at this and looking at all of the general areas on the public health safety. And, what's listed here talks about disease vectors and emergency preparedness, water, air quality. We already do some substantial monitoring in this area. There are many areas that need a lot of work. So we convened a group. We pulled, quite a few of our subject matter experts together, and we had one of our first meetings. And one of the things we realized immediately that we need involvement. The comment about all these groups getting together to talk at the same time is extremely important, because everything that we do is affecting the population everywhere. I mean, when we talked in great deal about a big topic that came up was the Long Island Sound and the shoreline properties and sewage, for example, and what that is doing right now, because, that sewage, there's not enough wall, and there's not enough, the sea level is getting very high, so that's affecting the ability to have those structures in there. And if sewage is going into your water supply, then you have no plan. So there's a bigger, broader question here, and we're looking forward to bringing other folks into the group and getting some perspective and trying to plan and develop something for the future.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds good. I'm glad you already had a meeting and had some good discussion. That raises in my mind a point too that I want to say about membership generally. So we have established the membership, but there is certainly opportunity as needed to bring in other experts in the fields on an ad hoc basis, or if in your particular theme area you think you need to add somebody permanently, that's, I think that's perfectly acceptable and encouraged. But we're not necessarily locked down in terms of the participation from experts that we need to draw from. So, thank you. Okay. In thinking about time, unless are there any burning questions? Okay, just to sort of keep on overall schedule, I'm gonna move ahead. So again, in terms of roles and expectations, we know that there's going to need to be work conducted between the meetings and in the various theme areas that will then feed up to the working group level. And the leads for those areas will guide the work and the discussions at the working group meetings within each of those areas. I think I kind of touched on the third bullet earlier, that we've tried to have some representation across the areas, and that last bullet of asking you to identify what you want to participate in, we've already taken care of. So we appreciate that. I think one important point on meetings that that may occur outside of this working group in the various theme areas, or that the working group may decide to have, in between the major meetings, is with respect to public notice. Should we address that now, James?
Yes.
Okay. So, and correct me if I make sure I get this right, but we're doing this as a transparent, open process. We are publicly noticing the working group meetings, and meetings that are of a sort of substantive policy discussion kind of nature should be publicly noticed. If it's just a coordination discussion about setting up a meeting or what the agenda should look like for a meeting, that's fine. But if it's going to be a more substantive discussion, we want to have those publicly noticed. Would you add anything to that, James, or does that hit the mark?
Yeah, that's all correct. And we're doing this for all of the working groups across the GC3. We have one person at DEEP who is coordinating the public noticing. So if you just provide the information to Brian or myself or Mary Beth, we can get it to Tatiana Abreu, who will post it online. So we want to make it as easy as possible, have that one main point of coordination. And we're asking folks to notice meetings at least 2 weeks in advance, so that the public has due notice.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question about that? And I'm sorry if it was just stated and I didn't pick up on it. So as an example, and for the transportation theme, if there's, let's say on that list that just went around, there's 4 or 5 people, or 3 or 4 or whatever, hopefully it's 6 or 7, who checked off interest in being part of that transportation theme group. If I want to have a conference call or get together and talk about some issues, is that the type of thing that I can do without public notice, or that I would need to do it 2 weeks in advance with public notice?
So I think if you want to have a conference call to go over, here's our game plan going forward, here's an issue area where, we should look into, what are your initial thoughts about that? That's fine to do over a conference call without public notice. But if you were planning to have a substantive discussion on one of those issues, or bring in an outside presenter to do a presentation, those are the things that we need to be publicly noticed. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, obviously we'll have to go with the flow and determine it. Does that even, if my group is even 3 people, does that still apply?
Again, I think if there are substantive discussions about policy, we want those to be done publicly. If you're doing independent research, that obviously doesn't need to be publicly noticed. If you're having a presentation, that should be noticed. So the goal here is just to encourage inclusivity and participation with the public. So we don't want to have a situation where we're having really substantive discussions, in the dark. So I think you probably will have to play it by ear a little bit. If you schedule a planning call and things get a little more into the weeds, that's something you can't control. But if you're planning to have a substantive discussion, that should be publicly noticed.
Okay, thanks.
The notice requirement itself is not particularly onerous, but the 2-week lead time might be for, especially a small group conference call. Is that something that's codified, or is that just sort of a general principle, 2 weeks? Can you respond to that a little bit?
That's a general principle that the GC3 is adhering to. I don't recall exactly what the state statutes require in terms of notice. I know state statutes do require an agenda to be posted at least 24 hours in advance.
Right.
And they require minutes to be posted within 5 business days. I don't recall the number of days prior that a meeting needs to be noticed. But again, I suspect that you'll have an idea about, if you're planning to have a really substantive discussion, you'll know at least 2 weeks in advance. That would be my sense.
But it is a guideline. We fell a little short of the 2 weeks for this meeting, for example.
Got it.
It may help in terms of timing coordination too with meetings, to be able to get everybody in the room, that 2 week notice probably would be a benefit for us too.
Okay. That's pretty small. I tried to cram too much on here, but and we're not gonna, we don't need to again review all these individually, but this is sort of what was referred to earlier in taking some of the recommendations from the 2011 plan and lumping them into these various areas. And some of them fit in multiple areas. Some of them actually don't necessarily seem to fit completely clearly into any one. But this is kind of generally where things seem to fall. Robert, I didn't actually see any that specifically fall under transportation, but I need to go back and look again. So that process for you may be easy.
And we're to review. So we're to, in our groups, look at these previous objectives and then either look to continue to build on them or add more to these?
Yeah, I think just as a starting point, we need to very briefly provide a status on the progress that has been made on them, if there has been progress, and if we can identify that.
Yeah, I was going to ask that next, like who would, some of these, I imagine there's deep people that have been involved in these and we need to have conversations with them. And
Sure. So Deep internally has started to populate a spreadsheet on progress to date on these matters. And so we'll put this out on the collaborative space for everybody to take a look at, and you can add anything that might be missing that you know of that addresses any one of those areas.
Regarding the collaborative space, I don't know, like you probably all received emails in the agency to sign up for dates for training on the Microsoft 360. I actually missed our department, so I was told I could just jump on to another department and just make sure I put my agency name in it. But, there is if you haven't looked at it, you should look at, your IT person probably sent around to everybody. Here's a schedule so you can get training on how this 360 works.
Yes. So I've used it a little bit. It's, it's not bad.
I haven't used it at all yet.
But yeah, a little bit of training might not hurt. All right. So again, Deep will be getting some formats out for doing the updates and looking at progress that we've made and thoughts on whether to continue develop these further or move on to other things. So, yes, sir.
If I may, in your minutes, could you include the thoughts on transportation that are not here? Or say TBD?
So this was based on my review of what was there and
So my thought is if transportation's not there, go ahead and say so. But if it is.
Oh, okay, sure.
In your minutes, add another bullet for transportation.
Sure.
And I think I'm sorry.
So I'm looking at the spreadsheet that you sent out with the meeting, and there are 67 actions, and that looks shorter than that. So can you just speak to the difference between those two?
Sure. Yeah, and so what we did there is in the spreadsheet, you'll see an area that's highlighted. Those are the ones that seem to apply to this working group. So there are others that were, natural resource oriented. The highlighted ones are the ones that looked sort of just as an initial cut like they belonged with this working group. and then I took sort of that highlighted group and
Okay.
separated them out, and I
Okay.
may have missed a few. It's just-
So we might also want to look at the ones that aren't highlighted and add them if we think it's appropriate.
Absolutely,
Great.
when the spreadsheet goes out, look at any and all of them. If you think something needs to be updated or addressed by this working group, then identify it.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so this is, I mentioned that there was a draft table of contents. Again, this is a little bit small, but some of it's just sort of repeating from section to section. And these are, this is draft. It hasn't been reviewed by the GC3 yet. That will be done at the next GC3 meeting. So it's preliminary, but these are sort of the kind of really substantive parts of the adaptation and resilience part of the report as we have envisioned it. So a section on working in natural lands that will largely be addressed by the Working in Natural Lands working group. A section on infrastructure and developed lands that will be addressed by this working group. And then a section on public health and safety, which will also be addressed by this working group. But to earlier points, there will be input from other working groups that have to feed into these sections. And so, you know, in each section, we would look to have some sort of opening background and context for that particular area, addressing what the importance of that sector is, or that theme, sort of compiling very briefly in a summary fashion what some of the impact assessment and vulnerability information that's available on that area is, describing the progress that's been made, and identifying some indicators and targets for the outcomes that we want to achieve. As I said earlier, we want to try and develop some fairly specific actions that we can accomplish. So we'd be looking at you know, identifying how do we know when we've achieved that action? What's the indicator of that, and what is our target? Was there a question?
Yes. I know we spoke about it earlier, and I don't know if I missed it in the first part of the meeting, but one of the concerns that I had regarded work that has been done, is being done right now, and what kind of inventory we have. I'm not quite sure what our starting point should be if there's already been work in certain areas, different groups have been doing different things. How are we inventorying? How are we kicking off? That I'm not clear on, and I apologize if it has been discussed already.
So that's a great question. Again, I think that a starting point is looking at the previous recommendations, the recommendations from the 2011 report, and let's try and characterize what's been done addressing each of those. But clearly, there's other work that's been done, you know, that may not sort of neatly fit into one of those recommendations, and we need to identify where that's happening and by whom. And
Is
what's
that
being
within
accomplished.
each separate group, or is that
I think-
action? How are we going about?
Yeah, I think each separate group needs to try and compile that, and then again, there's I think a lot of cross-pollination that can happen within this working group to supplement that. So we can take what's been compiled by a particular subgroup, and share that out to the rest of the group. We can put it on the SharePoint site, and others can contribute to that. But that is a good point.
And
Yes,
Circa has an inventory that we've been working on also.
Yeah, Circa has a lot of information. Was that going to your point, Joanna?
Oh, no, actually, but, still appreciate it. The 2011 report used for their assessment of climate change and predictions of climate change, they had used a scientific assessment for New York City and then used assumptions to expand the impacts to Connecticut. Will we be looking to the Science and Technology Working Group to identify which assessment we should be using to guide our vulnerability assessment in the report?
I would say yes. Looking to Mary Beth there, or James, that certainly seems, to be the scope of the Science and Technology Working Group. I don't know at what point in the process we'll have that guidance. But yeah, that's certainly, I think, what we expect.
Brian?
Yes, Alex?
What about parks and green space? Does that fall under land use?
So there may be a little crossover there between what Working in Natural Lands is doing and what this group is doing. That may be something we need to actually flesh out a little bit more internally at DEEP, but that's a good point. Yeah.
And also, what about recreational land or corridors?
So like greenways?
Greenways or like or I don't know, areas of recreation that might fall under public health, or like soccer fields.
Yeah. Okay.
Flood.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of those will fall to this group, but there may be certain others that are addressed by Working in Natural Lands. James, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so part of Monday's full GC3 meeting, there will be a discussion about areas of potential overlap and integration between various working groups. As many of the working groups are holding their first meetings either this week or last week, I think they're all starting to flesh out their areas of cognizance, and there's a recognition that there may be some overlap. So we want to identify those areas early on so that communication can occur between the working groups to understand who is covering what topic, where they need to collaborate, maybe hold joint meetings or joint discussions, or just be bouncing ideas off of each other. So we need to identify those areas early on. That will be part of the full GC3 discussion on Monday.
Okay, great. Stephanie, did you come?
Just a follow-up question about that, and it goes to the coordination aspect. Is there a list, and apologies if it's already like posted online or something, of membership of not only this group, but other working groups, and then I would imagine there's one for the full GC3, but I understand the public noticing guidelines, but if there's like a one-on-one conversation that would benefit being had, I think that information, sharing of contact information would be useful.
Yep, I think that's coming, right, James?
Yes, as all the groups have essentially now been fleshed out, I'm hoping to get all that information posted on the website by Monday.
Great.
Yep.
Brian?
Yes.
Is there going to be, at any point, looking at some of these initiatives that we're undertaking and then stepping up a level and looking at a regional approach as far as what is Rhode Island doing, what's Massachusetts doing, what's New York doing, and where might we be able to leverage the groups, all the states' work in really, compounding the interest basically as far as what we're doing, so there's a bigger regional gain from the work that might be done?
I think that is an objective we really need to keep in mind, and I think and the Commissioner Dykes has been very interested in looking at what our neighboring states are doing. So, for example, for the inventory of state assets, we've been looking at what Massachusetts did, and we're looking at what Rhode Island's doing. For a couple of reasons, it's important so that we're not reinventing the wheel. There are good models to follow from elsewhere, but also for the purpose that you're speaking of. Too, George, I think, in terms of just a critical mass of effort and particularly when we're thinking about across boundaries, there's, better opportunities for funding. So, yeah, good point.
I'd like to respond to Alex's question. Alex, obviously recreation land use is a big component in the shoreline areas, as you know.
Yeah.
State resources, state parks. So I personally would consider that to be part of the land use theme area. So we want you to be working on the land use theme area, if that was your question.
Okay, it's maybe.
Noted.
So we got you signed up on this list.
I see.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Be with you in a second, Adam. I know Nora, I think, had a question.
I just have a question about Microsoft Teams, and if all the working groups would be on the same platform, would we have access to each other's documents and information? I don't think that there's going to be a lot of sharing that way. I think that each of the teams will be established so that you can share. I mean, we've got 35 people in this, team alone, and to add that to that they're working in that will become a real deal. But certainly we can do what we can for the co-chairs of each of the working groups who are we can also post it to the website and publicly access as well. So, but we are on we're all guinea pigs with this. So there's a lot of learning that's going to go on and probably lots of glitches.
All right. Thank you. Adam, did you have a question?
It seems like words like indicator, target, outcomes, objective, strategies, implementation actions are really key, and those can be interpreted in different ways. So maybe having a couple examples that we can kind of model would be helpful. Number of people across municipalities, whatever it is, something that we can start to figure out the differences between, say, target and outcomes.
Yep.
Or what's an indicator?
Sure.
That would be really helpful to kind of get our brains going.
Yeah, I agree. So as part of the table of contents, I know, I think it was James who was working on sort of an instruction or guidelines for how to use and interpret the table of contents. So I don't remember how much of definition of those or examples of those different areas are in there, but that's a good point.
I have some scheduling conflicts this morning, so at 11 o'clock I'll need to leave, so whoever's talking at that time, it's not anything they said.
Thank you. Appreciate your time today, Rob. I understand that everybody has busy schedules. Yes.
So the end goal is a strategic plan of some sort with long-term and short-term goals. And within the working groups, when it was just brought up about outcomes and indicators, we're going to be prioritizing the different subcommittees, but then is it handed over, and then we're going to, at the next level, will be the target group, or are we going to, we talk about public health, again, Mike, we're going to talk about reducing asthma by such and such, surveillance, part of the strategic plan would be to have goals and outcomes, which in time will have to be measured. And so take us through that process so we stay within our lane.
So I'm not sure we're quite at the point yet where I can fully take you through that process. But that's, I think as we're having these kickoff discussions, those are the kinds of things we need to hear, so we make sure we do lay that out clearly for all the working groups. And I think that may be part of the discussion with the GC3 with respect to the table of contents. So yeah, how specific do we get in setting, or what kinds of targets are we looking to set? Yeah. Great comment. James, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think part of the thinking is when we're setting targets, we should also be identifying how we keep track of whether or not those targets are met. So it doesn't necessarily have to be DEEP that's doing that. It could be some other entity or or mechanism for identifying how we're doing in terms of measuring progress on the goals. I think that we want to try to include that where we can in the final report, so we're not just putting these goals out there with no way to verify how we're doing. We want to kind of set the track going forward in the final report.
Okay, we can come back and, I'm sorry, Todd. No.
I just had a question sort of in terms of thematic organization. I don't see any distinctions about different geographies in this, and I'm wondering if, for example, urban versus suburban versus rural, and some of, all of these issues have very different impacts depending on geography. So I'm wondering if that's going to be part of the discussion or somehow maybe weave itself into subsections in the table of contents.
That is a great point. And that's the reason we have working groups.
Okay.
To sort of flesh that out. But yeah, I think we need to think about that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anish.
And just one real quick comment, is there going to be any sort of overarching guidance with respect to the timeline or timeframes that we should be considering in terms of adaptive milestones? I mean, if we're looking at 2050, the problem set is X. If we're looking at 27, it's, or 2070, it's X plus, I wonder if the various committees all had some standardized temporal metric, that might give everybody sort of a little bit more guidance into how to organize the findings.
Yep, good comment. I think that's a topic for GC3 discussion as well. Yeah, thanks, Todd. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to Circa's presentation of some things they're working on and how they interact with us. We should have some time afterwards for some more question and discussions, but I want to make sure we get their piece in. So, Mary Beth, do you have control over the presentations? It's on the stick there. Perfect.
Okay.
We're still sharing the screen.
You might need to switch the view, yeah. They're still seeing the other one.
Are we seeing this one now?
I think so.
Okay. Are we good?
Yeah, I think so. All right. All right, so not to make this more complicated, but so Circa is currently undertaking a project that many of you know about called Resilient Connecticut. So this is through the National Disaster Resilience Competition grant to the state of Connecticut. This grant is being managed by the Department of Housing, our colleague Rebecca French at Department of Housing. She's managing the Resilient Bridgeport project, which is the large share of the grant for the state. But then there's this other project that Circa is working on called Resilient Connecticut. And the idea was to look across Fairfield and New Haven counties where HUD had made the determination that there was additional unmet need after Sandy, and, particularly in terms of housing. So that's our project area. But the idea is to look and take a regional approach to assessing climate impacts. Where else can we come up with projects that combine issues of housing and transportation, looking at the corridors and transportation routes from low-lying areas along the coast to the upland, and that's this idea of a resilience corridor, looking at transit-oriented development, and how are we supporting the state's TOD strategy, and develop some implementable pilot projects. So, roughly this breaks down into planning, technical support that we're doing, capacity building, and engagement. And so, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of the details of this, but I'd be happy to talk with, any of you that haven't heard me give this presentation 10 times already, about how we can sort of coordinate what we're doing. We could be a service to this group in the GC3 and provide some capacity if it's needed, if it's helpful. In addition, I think the issue is that if there's other groups that are doing work as part of the GC3 in Executive Order 3 that are better positioned to do that work, then we would like to incorporate that into our project to really kind of maximize the benefit for the stakeholders. So our basic timeline is it's a 3-phase project, and we're in phase 2 right now, which is really about doing a regional vulnerability assessment in Fairfield and New Haven counties, particularly looking at housing, transportation, drinking water, so on. And phase 3 of the project would be running from February 2021 to May of 2022. That's our end date, and that will be focused on more of the project level, community scale, site scale project development through the project. So in terms of the stakeholders we're bringing together, we are working with the Connecticut Department of Housing, who is a project sponsor for Resilient Connecticut. We've been working with the State Agencies Fostering Resilience Council. So this was named in the proposal to NDRC, something we call the State Agency Work Group. We're working with Lori from DPH and George from Connecticut Insurance, Brian from DEEP. We've had David Elder from DOT participating, and a number of state agencies participating and advising us as we go forward through this project. We also are proposing to create a stakeholder group that would look across the 2 counties and bring other stakeholders to the table and advise us on the project. We're calling that the Resilient Connecticut Collaborative. And so that's something my colleague Joanna is going to be kicking off in the next couple of months. And we've been having conversations with James and Brian about making sure there's not too much overlap between the working groups that come out of the GC3 and what we're proposing there. We're also working with the regional councils of government in Fairfield and Haven County, so Naugatuck Valley, West Cog, Metro Cog, and South Central Cog. So they're going to help us to incorporate a lot of the existing planning work that's been done, hazard mitigation planning and the multi-jurisdictional planning that's been done by the COGs. We're also going to be procuring a consultant. We put out an RFQ in February, so we'll have the ability to bring engineering consultants on board to do some of the implementation planning and initial design for the projects. So in terms of addressing this issue of, where do we start? And, we really, in developing the planning framework for Resilient Connecticut, we've tried to be really deliberative about taking stock of everything that's been done in Connecticut since Sandy. There's been an awful lot of work that's been done to raise awareness, particularly on the coast, of sea level rise and flooding issues. And a lot of plans have been put together. So, we've spent a good deal of time putting all of that stuff, particularly in those 2 counties, looking at all the plans that have been done and making sure that we're looking across these different scales. So we've looked at the municipal scale, plans of conservation and development and how they're incorporating sea level rise and climate change into their strategies and recommendations. The natural hazard mitigation plans at the local level, municipal coastal resilience plans, and some of the community resilience building workshops that TNC has been doing. And then looking at what the COGs have been doing in terms of this, also doing multi-jurisdictional and regional POCDs and natural hazard mitigation plans, the transportation improvement plans, et cetera. And then, of course, the state level, looking at the hazard mitigation plan at the state level and some of these other documents. So for example, we've looked at the Department of Housing after Sandy had a Sandy recovery program where they provided funds to a number of towns and communities to do initial coastal resilience plans through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. So a lot of towns got to do their first crack at a coastal resilience plan, initial kind of list of recommendations and understanding of where the problems might be. There's also been some planning around, wastewater treatment and some of the infrastructure through that program. And so this is something we've incorporated into our inventory. So TNC, as I mentioned, Adam's been doing a lot of community resilience building workshops. They've developed a database of projects. So this is on the TNC site, coastalresilience.org. So there's a number of different projects that have been identified through those workshops. So we want to make sure that we incorporate those projects into our inventory and our database as we move forward with Resilient Connecticut. So this is just a little snapshot of how we're putting all this together and sort of looking across all of the towns. Like I said, we've primarily been focused in Fairfield and New Haven County because of the requirements of our grant, but this is something we'd be happy to share with the group and sort of build on as a methodology for doing an inventory, and also expanding to other areas like public health and that are relevant to this group. So the process of that inventory, we put together a workshop last spring where we had some folks actually in the room joined us and presented at the workshop, where we looked across these different scales, the local scale, the regional scale, and just sort of asked that question: how has Connecticut been incorporating climate change into planning, and what is the status of that? So we put together a little summary after some discussion. We had some roundtable discussions and breakout groups in the afternoon to kind of get a sense of what people felt like the barriers and the gaps were to getting to implementation from the plans, et cetera. So, and that's something we could also share with the group if you're interested. So I thought I would just present, given all the inventory, looking across all these different plans and having conversations with a number of folks across the state for the last year, these were just a few of the things that came to mind, different themes that have been coming up as we've looked at the inventory and looked at what's going on in Connecticut since Sandy and Irene. So the first thing is, obviously there's been a lot of planning, not much implementation. So, and obviously funding is a big issue, but the question is there something besides funding that is preventing the projects that have been identified in these plans and driving them to implementation? There seems to be some sort of a gap between the preliminary planning that's been done and actually getting a project completed on the ground. And that might be something that for this group to sort of zero in on and try to, understand. Second, there seems to be a need for prioritization of issues. So even in areas where towns and institutions have funding, there's just so many issues and so many projects that have been identified. There's a need for some sort of a framework to actually do the prioritization. Which projects should we do first? Which should we do second? What are our most important issues in the near term, and then the medium term and the long term? So having that prioritization framework would be, I think, a key value in getting us to implementation. So third, cost-benefit analysis, or having a common methodology for performing cost-benefit is something that's needed. I know Rebecca, as part of her process to do Resilient Bridgeport, they did an awful lot of work on the cost-benefit analysis, and that's been a huge value in them going out and getting additional funding for the project. A lot of the towns that have projects that have been identified, they maybe haven't had the capacity or the ability to do that cost-benefit, or even the strategy for what should we include in terms of benefits, what should we include in terms of costs. So that's another area that I think could help the state move to implementation. Fourth, even if there is more benefits than costs to a project, who benefits from the project and who should pay? And this is really where the issue of equity and thinking about environmental justice becomes important in terms of, if we're going to advocate for significant public investment in responding to climate change and making the state more resilient, we really need to think about how, we strategize in terms of understanding the benefits of projects and understanding, the strategy for paying for them. Fifth, there's a strong desire to keep things as they are. So, really the message of change is actually inevitable, and we're not going to be able to protect every single thing exactly where it is, exactly how it is currently. And that's something that the message is not really, that conversation doesn't seem to be happening at the local level in terms of driving the change in thinking. So this is the idea of like resilience versus adaptation. So are we going to keep everything in place and be resilient, or are we going to respond to the changing conditions and adapt? And so that, those aren't necessarily the same things. I did forget that. Thank you, George. So, sort of building on that, number 6, the education of the public and stakeholders. This has constantly come up every time we've had a conversation about, what do we need to do to make the state more resilient? We need more education. We need to engage the public more. And I think this feedback is coming from that, related to number 5, in that there really needs to be some group, and it can't necessarily be the local planning and zoning commission that's going to come in and say, hey, we need to radically rethink how we, think about land use in our community. There needs to be some sort of group to come together and start to present the science and present the information to the public so that, the local planning and the local capacity can start to, have that conversation. Number 6, we need to move beyond the coast. It makes sense that after Sandy and Irene, there was a big focus on coastal flooding and coastal resilience, but, and this was mentioned, in Aisha's comment, as you move away from the coast, there's a different set of priorities, a different set of issues that become more important. You start to think about the heat impacts of climate change and what does that mean for our urban areas and where we have those heat islands. You start thinking about drinking water and human health become more important in the conversation, or just as important, rather. Number 8 is who has the capacity to push the projects to implementation, right? So I think there's a need for a continued and a committed public dialogue about projects and about issues at the scale that would facilitate decision-making. And that's something that, it's not clear. Some towns have more capacity than others, and there hasn't been necessarily, an even distribution of that capacity to push the projects forward. 9, we need to think about diverse sources and combinations of funding. This is something that the financing working group is going to be working on. But, this issue is happening all over the country, all over the world. In some places, there might be a greater scale of the issue even than in Connecticut, say Miami or Norfolk, or so we're going to be competing against those places as well for federal funding. It's really important that we start to figure out some of these issues like the prioritization, the cost benefit, get everybody to work together, because it's going to require the combination of funding from different sources to really make this work. And number 10 is, I think we need to break down the silos and work together. In Connecticut, there seems to be, I guess, it being a home rule state and it being the land of steady habits, everybody likes to have control over, their area. It seems like there's a lot of turf battles that have happened over the years. And, I think personally that we owe it to the state and we owe it to the stakeholders to try to break those silos down and work together where we can. So in terms of Resilient Connecticut and how we maybe could be of use, so we have our scope of work and we have our commitments to HUD through NDRC. But, if there may be a way for us to pilot some of the approaches that the EO3 is calling for, particularly like, looking at the vulnerability assessment of state assets and operations. That's something we might be able to pilot in our project area, and then it could be rolled out to the rest of the state. In addition, as I mentioned, if there's working groups that are doing work that would be, they have better capacity and they're better suited to do that work, how can we make sure that that comes into our project and then we can take that off of our plate and reduce the duplication of effort. And then the third thing would be coordinating on the meetings and events. We have a spring workshop that we've been planning. We had been talking about doing a workshop on climate and public health. So that's something that we might be able to coordinate with the groups that are working on that within the GC3, and it could be a useful meeting for those purposes. And then in the fall, we'll have an annual summit in November, so that's something we could also try to combine with the efforts of the GC3 and just coordinate on some of the engagement. So I think that's it. If anybody has any questions, comments, criticisms?
Indeed.
I saw that your timeline for moving to the project and implementation phase is February of next year, and it looks like you are bringing on a consultant to help with or to do the vulnerability assessment for those counties. What is the timeline for bringing on that consultant? I mean, that's a short period of time, it seems like, for a large scope of work that you're interested in.
Yeah, it does seem like a short period of time.
I mean, I imagine it's something that this is the first time this will happen, and that, as you move forward, it'll be again, and this is really laying the groundwork for it, but I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, so one thing is that we're not going to be able to actually build the projects. So that's something I should make clear. And that is part of the requirements of the grant. That it was a planning grant. So I think we can go up to about a 30% design on projects, which is really just what do we think the project's going to cost? How long is it going to take? Here's we've had a community conversation to think about the feasibility of different options, and the community selected this option. We know how much it's going to cost, and we have a preliminary design. That's about the scale of what we're able to do with the requirements of the grant. We put out the RFQ so that we could pre-qualify a number of consultants and firms so that we would not have to necessarily put out a second RFP or an RFQ for individual projects. So we tried to design this so that we could just ask different qualified consultants to do the scope of work as it comes up. And so hopefully that will allow us to be a little bit more quickly responsive to, all right, we've identified a set of projects, and now we have some firms that are ready to do the work in that third phase.
So are you also looking for consultants to do the analysis and then consultants to do the concept design? Those are two separate things, essentially?
Yeah, so part of the technical support aspects of the project, Circa, has a whole team of folks that are going to be doing analysis and modeling, particularly around flood issues and sea level rise. So some of that analysis will be able to feed into the work that the consultant is doing, and that we could take that off of their plate. So that's some of the capacity that Circa has that will hopefully, work with what the consultant's doing.
And that's already been underway too, so for several months, so we're just not getting started now.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay.
John, I was wondering, it's just, when you look at all the different projects, you said we've done a lot of planning, no implementation, and I'm just wondering, when you look at all the planning we've done, what projects out there are close to, shovel ready? Because we all know that, when there's a federal disaster, and we know that with the president's signing of the catastrophe bill, there will be a lot more dollars available. And I think states that are more at the shovel ready, identifying projects that are shovel ready, will be probably much further along the line and can benefit more from those federal dollars. And so, if we look at all the things that you guys are doing, which ones should we be really pushing to be at that stage? So when it happens, we can be ready to secure as much federal funding as possible.
Yeah, so in terms of the projects that are out there currently, I wouldn't feel comfortable giving you a list at this point. I think we're trying to work with the COGs who have, participated in a lot of the identification of the projects so far. And they have spreadsheets that are filled with projects that have come out of the municipal hazard mitigation plans. And we've been having some conversations with Demis about putting together just a giant spreadsheet of all of the hazard mitigation projects across the whole state, and then figuring out which ones need which type of analysis or whatever it would be to get them to shovel ready. So I don't think we're there in terms of our understanding, and anybody in the room who disagrees, feel free. But I think it's still sort of there still hasn't been the coordination to figure out, all right, these are the shovel ready projects and these are the highest priority projects. There's been some work around that on some scales, but we haven't gotten there yet as a state.
I think it definitely comes down to prioritization at this point. I think at least at the regional level, we know what the problem areas are. It's how do we prioritize them based on what's going to be, what's going to make the most impact. So it's really that coordination that I think CERT is going to get into. We're looking forward to it.
I think that should be a real high priority, just, because the more ready we are, the more we're going to be able to take advantage of it.
Sounds like a recommendation from the working group to go in the plan.
See, we're already there.
I'm gonna go to Kevin, and then to be respectful of the schedule, I want to make sure we leave time for a public comment period and a quick wrap up. But yes, Kevin.
Real briefly, just in terms of the general issue of project prioritization. This is the reason why MPOs were created back in the early 60s. It seems very straightforward that the answer to that issue, which I agree with, over there. So, to the extent that their charter needs to be expanded or they provide some additional support, staffing or otherwise, those should probably be recommendations from others. Vehicle, the institution with the expertise and the mandate already agreed.
Okay, good comment. Thank you. All right, so we'll allow for a public comment period. If I know we have a couple of members of the public in the room, if anyone would like to make any comments, keeping them to a couple of minutes. And is there any one member of the public who would like to comment on the process or the GC3 or the working group?
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I think what we just went through in your presentation, John, was really well formed. And just what George said about, we don't have any projects. We must have some projects over the last 10 years. In my agency, we could talk about what we've done to implement what we saw after Storm Sandy. To your plan that you developed for us, we're actually implementing actual law changes to require generators for this type of water system because of what, so there actually are examples of where an agency has been mindful of what happened 10 years ago and has made actual changes. So I'd hate to say that none of us have done anything, because I think a lot of us have around the room, have done work in this area. And so I'm wondering if we could highlight the work that has been done. Because I think, to George's point, when the next storm comes, it's good to know what has been done, and have an inventory of those good projects that either towns have taken on, or I keep calling them RPOs, county governments have done, or agencies, or any other group that have taken these things on. There's great examples. I could give you 5 of them from my agency, because we have taken steps to make change.
So when we put the spreadsheet out there, I'll expect you to be updating that with the progress.
I will give you a presentation, if you have another hour, I'll tell you all about it. Thank you.
Yeah, just to respond, I don't want to at all characterize that nothing has been done, or that there hasn't been great projects that have been identified and that are shovel ready. I think there are. This is more of a sort of a macro view in terms of we've had a lot of planning, but we haven't necessarily moved in a coordinated fashion to take action across the board. And to the extent that there are good examples of that, I think that would be a great function of this group, to bring those to the surface. And then obviously, if we can learn from the success from somewhere else, that would be a benefit to everyone. So,
is anyone from Demis on this group? Because when there is a disaster, they are the ones that are pretty much the lead, and I think having them being involved in this group and knowing, as we start getting projects that get closer to shovel ready, they'll know where to go, and won't be trying to figure out what do we need to do.
Yes, they are represented. Not here today, I think, but yeah.
So, and there's another small angle, though, that I think we're sort of avoiding. I mean, I know there's a freestanding committee on finance, right? But we are sort of avoiding that word finance in the discussion we've just been having, right? We always wait for the next disaster to think that's going to be a trigger for federal funds. I'm not sure that's a workable model anymore. I think we got to think about Connecticut-centric mechanisms, and maybe it's an interesting one where there's the finance group and this group. It'd be really cool to get a briefing from finance as we're closing in on our findings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think it's going to be a combination. I mean, we want to be prepared when the federal funding does arrive to respond to that. But yeah, right. You're right. We can't rely on that.
I'd also add. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would just, to speak up for New Haven, maybe as a case study for a couple of these comments, is I do respect the first barrier not only being funding. There are other things that are preventing implementation that we should be discussed. But I also think there have been really great case studies of successes, and I think that we have a few of them that we'd be happy to share. But I think it is a good point to make sure that we document those first, and maybe there'd be something interesting that comes out of where implementation is happening and where it's not, and maybe that will help identify those other barriers. But yeah, to say that nothing's been done is maybe not our experience, everyone's experience in this room.
That's a good point. So I know I had offered a public comment and we didn't get one, but I think I see one now. So yes, sir.
One word input: landfills. Many of the landfills in Connecticut are located on water sites, specifically the rivers. It's a long-term item. Not so long on the shoreline. It's a public health item. I suggest you add landfills just for completeness.
Okay, thank you for that. So there were various ones going up. Aisha, and I know we're coming up on the close of the meeting. We can go a little longer if folks are okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, just as we look towards implementation, I think we also have to consider private sector in here and look at how we can, and maybe this is really more in the financing group, but to your point, like look at other models that aren't just
grant-based or waiting for that federal funding. We really have to look at partnering with our local business community. Also, it's really through land use. We're working on a lot of various different green ordinances and incentives to have people build in a more resilient or sustainable way. So there's other tools that we can use besides the, waiting for the grant. So I just encourage thinking about many different implementation strategies in that way.
Thank you. Aisha, Bill, I know you got your hand up earlier.
Yeah, just really quick, just kind of following up on that and what we heard back here. There are different categories of that. So like for the Clean Water Fund, it's mandated you have to have resiliency built into the project if you're going to spend state dollars. New Haven's been doing big swaths of contracting for, bioswales and things like that. And then you have the private sector or public-private partnership. So maybe one way of looking at the different implementation that has occurred, because it is not connected for sure. You cannot just look for how many rain gardens have been built in Connecticut. Maybe you guys have that information over at Circa, but so that would help with what's working, what's not, what can be expanded, that type of categorization.
Yep. Thanks, Bill.
John, great presentation. I love the 1 through 10. You alluded to it on a couple of bullets. So a lot of the projects that we have are bricks and mortar projects involving government agencies and some businesses. But the conversation at some point, very soon, really needs to transition over to the community and what they can do, because one, we need buy-in, and two, we need individuals to start changing some of their ways. And at some point, we've got to transition over to that, because that is the root cause, or one of the root causes, depending on the science you look at. That was in Circa's charge.
Yeah, I think, as part of our process, we're trying to think about the different scale of issues. And you have, it really runs the gamut. You have homeowner issues that are really highly local. You have neighborhood issues that are maybe shared amongst a group of homeowners. And so there's a different type of conversation that, and maybe technical support or different resources that are required there. Then there's issues that there might be municipal scale issues that they really require a conversation on that municipal level. What do we do about the wastewater treatment plant, those type of things. And then there are these larger issues that, where the issue just spans towns, like, what is the vulnerability of the rail system in Connecticut? That's the problem that can't be addressed by a town. It might not even be able to be addressed by a state. That might be something that the entire Northeast needs to come up with a regional strategy for that. So there's different issues and there are different scales. So we've been trying to sort of figure out the right scale. Our particular project, I think, as we kicked it off, we got a lot of feedback about, there's already been a lot of municipal scale planning. And so I think we were trying to see, where is the gap, what hasn't been done necessarily. And so that's why we got sort of the mandate to look at it regionally. But certainly that there's conversations that need to happen at different scales to address this issue.
To follow up on, we got kind of pulled into the project discussion, but that's part of our HUD grant the end game is looking at particular projects and designing to a certain standard and getting those moving forward. But throughout our project, and I hope that throughout the adaptation committee, we'll be looking at policies, programs, and projects so that we can be making sure that we're dealing with cross-scale issues or identifying regulations that are either barriers or drivers for change. Like, for example, changing Statute 832 so that POCDs consider climate change for inland communities and expanding beyond just coastal flooding. So hopefully we can be cognizant of those through the working groups and through the subcommittees and identifying those as we go along. So it's not just shovel-ready projects, but that's one part of the solution.
All right. take one or two more. I want to be respectful of people's time and wrap up. I know we probably talk about this all day, but yes, John.
I just want to, Jess Claire isn't here, but I do want to speak up for Sustainable Connecticut having a really great database available of projects that have been done and maybe particular actions within Sustainable Connecticut. It might be worth mining that for a bit and having them maybe present that data a little bit different than they currently have it, because it's kind of hidden within the site, but just as a database that already exists of projects that have been done.
Yeah, great one. Yes, Jess could not be here today, but she will be involved. Thank you. All right, so I think with that, I'm going to try and wrap things up here. A lot of great discussion today, and great questions on both process and substance moving forward. We clearly have a lot to think about and a lot of work to do. I appreciate everybody's enthusiasm and commitment to the cause here. Next steps, so we'll set an April meeting date. Again, 23rd is what we're proposing. We'll put out a meeting request to everybody about that and make sure that looks like a good date. And then so there's a GC3 meeting on Monday, and we will also, get out some further direction on what we need to be working on before the next meeting, including compiling that progress and identifying sort of gaps and needs moving forward, and perhaps additional tasks. But thank you all. Yes.
Brian, should we expect to hear from the chair of our subgroup between now and